So we've been talking an awful lot about what's been going on in Prussia, with Frederick the Great, and with people like Goethe, moving back to Weimar, and so on. We're talking about an area that is modern day Germany, but we've kind of not really talked about that same period and the kind of cultural developments that are going on in the more southerly part of the world where people are speaking German during this period. And that is in the Habsburg Empire, that is modern day Austria, effectively what becomes in the 19th century the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but is before that just called the Habsburg Empire. Its center is in Vienna. It's got a different royal family, whereas Frederick the Great comes from the Hohenzollerns. The royal family in the Habsburg Empire are the Habsburgs. So we're going to learn a little bit about how Frederick the Great isn't the only enlightened absolutist monarch of his era. The other one is in Vienna, and it is Joseph II of Austria. So this is the lecture where we turn our eyes and our vision south. We look at the same period, the late 18th century, and we say, what's going on there? What are the big developments politically there? What does the Habsburg Empire look like structurally? What is the Habsburg family up to in the late 18th century during this period we call the Enlightenment? And what are the huge cultural developments that we should be focused on in our German cultural history class, instead of literature, which is what is really going through enormous leaps forward with Weimar classicism in the northerly part of the German-speaking world, the place that sees enormous developments and exciting new things happening in the southern part of the German-speaking world is Vienna, and it's Viennese musical classicism that we remember as being at its zenith in the late 18th century. We're going to learn about the fact that there's this great trinity of musicians active in the late 18th century, early 19th century in Vienna, and they are, of course, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. In this lecture, we're going to talk about Haydn and Mozart, and in the next, you're going to learn, or when we come to talk about Romanticism, we're going to talk about Beethoven as that third person in the musical triumvirate based in Vienna. So, the Habsburg Empire.
I was talking about the fact that this is the Goethe era, right? The age of Goethe, the Goethe side, and I gave you in the last lecture an introduction to these movements and the fact that Schiller was alive and when Goethe was alive and so on. So in the context of what we've already talked about today, I'm just showing you this graphic to see how much things overlap. So Weimar classicism, we think of it ending as a movement in the early 1800s, whereas Viennese classicism, with Beethoven still being so active for so long, stretches a little further, even though its high point is around 1800. Haydn, Joseph Haydn, is the first of the great composers of this era, based near Vienna, and he dies in the first decade of the 19th century. Mozart is way younger than Haydn, but he dies so young that he also dies a lot earlier than Haydn. They knew each other and they were friends. And finally, we have Beethoven. Beethoven is younger again, and Beethoven comes to Vienna because of the reputation of Haydn and Mozart. And so we're going to listen to some music by Haydn and Mozart and look forward to Beethoven. The ruler at the time that Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven were creating Viennese musical classicism is Joseph II, Joseph II of Austria, Habsburg Emperor. He's followed by Franz II. So very briefly, there's a gap there, and it's because there was a Leopold who briefly reigned, but only very, very briefly. In fact, Mozart wrote his coronation music, but Franz II is the one who is the most famous Habsburg emperor after Joseph. So who were the Habsburgs? The Habsburgs, sometimes spelled with a B, sometimes spelled with a P, was a dynasty in what we might, I'm putting Austria in inverted commas because Austria isn't really a thing until a country per se till the 20th century. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and that's made up of a patchwork of lots of other different areas with different ethnic groups, parts of modern-day Italy and Croatia and so on and so forth. We'll we'll look at the map of Austria when we come to talk about Vienna in the late 19th century. But it's enough for us to know right now that the Habsburgs were the ruling emperors. They were also de facto emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, which is now super weak, but at least in name, they become the Habsburg emperors. And Joseph II was, for example, also not just Habsburg emperor, but also Holy Roman emperor. But this family, the Habsburgs, was a dynasty from the 1200s. Very often they become, when we start to talk about the Holy Roman Empire as being the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, in the 16th century, it's from then on that we really see it's the Habsburgs that are at the heart. They were Catholic, so they were on the side against Gustavus Adolphus during the 30 Years' War. And the Habsburg Empire has expanded enough, and there's enough intermarriage between the Spanish crown and the Austrian crown that we come to a point where the Habsburg Empire is vast and it spans the world and includes territories in Spain and the Netherlands, and Mexico as part of the Habsburg Empire for a while. They're also the kings of Hungary. This becomes contentious as Hungary looks for independence in the 19th century, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture. But the Habsburg emperors are kings of Hungary. That's why we end up finding that they're the K and K. They're both Kaisers and kings. They're both emperors and kings. This is just I could have picked any period to look at, but this is a map just to give you a sense from 1547. So 1547, we're going back a couple hundred years here. From where we are, the main focus of this lecture is the late 1700s, but this just gives you a sense of how old this empire is and how long it has been so powerful. So Spain already is under the dominion of Charles V, Carlo V, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, the Netherlands, parts of the world that we just don't associate with an Austrian tradition came on into the Habsburg Empire over the centuries. So by the time we're looking at the 18th century, which is what we are doing now, this is the emblem. The emblem changes over time depending on which countries are now included in the dominions of the Habsburg Empire. Sometimes this crest changes slightly, but these are the emblems, the regalia of the Holy Roman Empire. So the world with the cross on top of it, for example, is part of its crest. And this ancient double-headed eagle is also, which is an emblem that's been around for a long time. Later on gets interpreted as it being the Kingdom of Hungary and the Empire of Austria as being the two heads. But that double-headed eagle has been around for a much longer time. Anyway, that's their emblem. And the mother of Joseph II was Maria Theresia. She was an archduchess, and she became the heir of Karl VI in 1740. So she's the Empress of Austria. Here's a woman who is actually an extraordinarily powerful monarch in the 18th century. And as we know, this is the age of absolutism. And in fact, there are ties between her and the court of the Louis. So Marie Antoinette is one of her children who marries King Louis XVI of France, the one who will eventually lose his head in the French Revolution. So she's very much, she has a lot of children who she marries off into royal and aristocratic families all over Europe. So she's very much part of that older tradition of monarchy and of absolutism, but she herself and especially her son are very influenced by the new ideas of the Enlightenment. So she's a very forward-thinking kind of monarch. She puts her stamp on this era to such an extent that in Austrian history this is called the Maria Theresian era, the era of Maria Theresia. Even when her son is on the throne, it's still considered her era. She's kind of invented Austria in the 18th century. She has 11 daughters and 5 sons, so she's very typical in that sense of her era that she had many, many children. And she's a legend in contemporary Vienna. If you ever go to Vienna, you'll see lots of places named after her. You'll see her image everywhere, and you'll see the kind of homage paid to her as one of the greats of Austrian history. She co-ruled from 1765 with her son Joseph II. So again, that's a sense of the power that she had. She wasn't, because she was a woman, stepping down to let her son take over. She co-ruled with him and kind of educated him in the techniques of statecraft. So we don't really have a Joseph II. We don't really have this flowering, this cultural flowering of Vienna in the late 18th century if we don't have Maria Theresia and her son. This is Maria Theresienplatz in Vienna. It's in the middle of, it's between two of the huge museums of the city. And this is her sitting on her great monument. I've said that already. He and she represent, but especially he, enlightened absolutism. So he is an absolute monarch. He has absolute authority. There is no parliament system. However, he tries to follow the same principles as Frederick the Great in terms of the kinds of things that he supports and the kinds of things that he outlaws. His brother Leopold II takes the throne after him, and it's his nephew Franz II who takes over the throne after Leopold dies very quickly, and Franz II becomes the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon forces him to give up the title and kind of dissolves the empire in 1806. But again, as I say, it's not really a powerful empire by then. These people are powerful because they're Habsburgs, and the Habsburg Empire is enormously wealthy and powerful. So here he is, just like Frederick the Great. He is interested in the arts and in music, and so we get to this flourishing of music that happens under his reign. I've already talked about classicism being a particular enthusiasm in the 18th century, and ever since the 18th century, an enthusiasm for Greek style. And the hallmarks of that Greek style are symmetry, balance, harmony, simplicity, grandeur. So never an ugly theme, never dissonance, but harmonious, never overwrought, never over-decorated, simple lines, and so on. These are the hallmarks of classicism that get brought into music by these great composers of the 18th century. So when you hear someone say, I like classical music, think about what the word classical means in that sentence. In fact, we use the word classical music to mean anything that isn't pop or anything that isn't more modern, right, for the most part. We go back and we'll talk about Bach and say, oh, Bach was a great composer of classical music. Technically, he isn't. Technically, classical music gets invented as a style in the 18th century with the likes of Mozart and Haydn. So classical music is a phenomenon, and it's fine. I'm not saying you need to change the way you use the word classical music. Everybody uses it to mean that. But if we're going to be historically accurate when we're looking at the past, we need to look at this period as the period when classicism, like music has a history too. Everything has a history. And this is the moment when classical music, as we understand it, kind of almost gets born in Europe. It follows Baroque. We heard some Baroque music when we listened to some Handel, and we listened to a little bit of Bach. And there's a lot of ornamentation in Baroque music, a lot of repetition in Baroque music. So in a Baroque opera, you might have somebody singing the same verse 3 times and singing it slightly differently with different ornamentation in their voice, adding little twirls and twists that they make up as they go along. That kind of thing doesn't happen once we hit the classical era. It doesn't really happen, for example, in a Mozart opera. We lose the repetition, we lose the decoration, and so on. So the musical period that follows is Romanticism, and we're going to talk tomorrow about Romanticism in literature, Romanticism in art, and Romanticism in music. But between Baroque music and Romantic music comes this high period of classicism, and its heart, its global heart, is in Vienna. I'm just repeating what I said earlier there, that it's following all the lines of Winckelmann's principles of classicism. Those of you who are interested in the history of music will know that it's also the era when we see the development of the sonata as a form, And we see more of an emphasis on instrumental music, on people listening to chamber music, people listening to music that has no words associated with it. So you might have had choral music in churches before this. Think of Hildegard von Bingen. Or we might have had one instrument dominating, like organ music in the church context. Or you had an orchestra playing music at an opera down in the pit, while the story, the words are being sung up above. Think even of the Coffee Cantata, which was music, but words were always set to music to tell the story. So classical music, as we understand it, as we think of it today, the classical music of symphonies and sonatas and quartets and quintets and so on, that is highly concertos, highly instrumental, maybe with one instrument standing out from the others, as in a concerto, with a conductor kind of bringing all these things together. This is a phenomenon of the 18th and 19th centuries. This is a development that comes along with classicism. The piano has also not been an instrument that's been around forever. The piano comes into it, so there's been a pianoforte, harpsichords, other kinds of combinations, so instruments that have strings, but the strings are hammered, which is what a piano means soft, and forte means loud. So pianoforte is an instrument that can be hit hard and loud, or softly and quietly, and we call it a piano now for short. But the piano develops in the 18th century, comes into its own in the 19th century, and someone like Beethoven is already writing a lot of piano music, concertos for piano and things like that, which is not something that someone like Haydn was so invested in. So these are some of the developments in the history of music happening at the time, and as I say, the giants are those three people. So Haydn is the first of these names we're going to look at. Haydn lived from 1732 to 1809. He was born in Rohrau, went to Vienna at the age of 8, and he went to Vienna to join the Vienna Boys Choir, the Wiener Knabenchor, which is still a choir. There's still an active Viennese boys choir that travels the world and is one of the most famous choirs in the world. And he was a choir boy, so he had a beautiful voice, but that was part of his education. He was extremely lucky. I mean, he was also extremely talented, but he was extremely lucky because he landed a job with an incredibly wealthy family. The Esterházy family is a Hungarian family with a lot of property very close to Vienna, and palace in Vienna, and they employed him as their music director. So the Esterházy family, it's not a court per se, but it's an extremely wealthy family that has him creating music for them for their entertainment. And so that gave him a lot of money and a lot of time. So in the history of music, it's very, very unusual that someone who is really talented ends up also being lucky enough to be somebody who has a job that keeps body and soul together, and therefore can make a living and write and do nothing but write music every day. We see that's part of Mozart's disaster, is that he can't keep body and soul together in terms of earning music. Or someone like Wagner, it takes him a long, long time to find a patron who allows him to do nothing but work and write music. So Haydn is lucky in that sense. That's the Eisenstadt Esterházy Palace, which you can visit today. He was not living in Vienna, but near Vienna. He becomes friends with Mozart. Both of them are Freemasons. Freemasonry was very common at the time. And Haydn also does some traveling. So from 1791 to 95, he goes to England and he writes a London Symphony and an Oxford Symphony. And so he has a following all over Europe. And he becomes ill in 1802. Eventually he dies in 1809, but he has left an enormous legacy. That is, he's considered the father of the classical symphony. So you think symphonies have been around forever? They haven't. He kind of invents the classical symphony. If you go, we have symphony orchestras here in at USC and in South Carolina, and symphony orchestras that can play enormous pieces of instrumental music written for a lot of different instruments. They are something like we even call these orchestras, symphony orchestras, because of this particular form. But it wasn't a form that was around forever, and he is the person who really kind of makes that form a standard part of the repertoire, a kind of challenge to every composer who follows him, tries to write symphonies. So he wrote over 100 symphonies. He wrote chamber music, which is music for small groups that can be played in a chamber in a smaller room. So for example, 83 string quartets, 14 masses, 6 oratorios. So unlike Bach, who's mostly writing sacred music and he's writing some secular music, Haydn is writing mostly secular music, but he also writes some sacred music. 52 piano sonatas, right? So there's the piano beginning to really be an instrument that is taken seriously. It's, as I say, it's Beethoven who really kind of pushes it to the next level, and of course Chopin and all of the 19th century composers. But Haydn is the father of all of these things. I'm going to play 2 seconds of 2 pieces of music. I exaggerate, probably a minute of 2 pieces of music. And one of them is just to give you a taste of his Farewell Symphony, one of his symphonies, Symphony number 45, and just to show you too how easy it is to find this material online. And then I'm going to play a little bit of a hymn he wrote called the Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, unseren guten Kaiser Franz. Gott erhalte Franz den Kaiser, unseren guten Kaiser Franz. So this Kaiser hymn, this anthem to the Kaiser Franz, ends up becoming the same music as the German national anthem. So I'm going to play you Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit für das deutsche Vaterland. That's the German national anthem, the words that people sing to it today. And so there's a real kind of tie between this Austrian composer and the German tradition, right? So that tells you how tied together these places that we think of as separate countries now, Austria and Germany, have been in the past. If it's an Austrian composer who was writing for the Kaiser, it's his music to which the German national anthem today is played. So let's listen to just a tiny, tiny bit of 2 things. I only played that because it might already be familiar to you. I'm sure if you explore the symphonies and the music of Haydn, you'll recognize a lot of bits and pieces. This is a live recording, so it's a little bit noisy and awkward, but it is the music in the background that I'm hoping that you recognize. I'm playing that in part because it's hard to find this music without it being the German national anthem, and here this is clearly an Austrian context with people wearing all different uniforms with different Austrian regiments and the double-headed eagle that is typical of the Austrian Empire. So this is a memorial mass in Vienna for recent, obviously, memorial mass for one of the Habsburgs. Okay. The other and even more famous composer who's active at the time is Mozart, of course, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And he is born in 1756 and dies in 1791. So he had a very, very short life. He was born in Salzburg. He was born in a house that says on the front of it now, Mozart's birth house. And it didn't say that when he was born. just FYI. So he was born in reasonably nice, into a reasonably, I mean, they weren't a wealthy family. His father was also a musician, but they were not a poor family. He was also a child prodigy, so his father taught him and his sister to compose. His sister was also super talented, and they traveled the courts of Europe with Mozart, showing pieces that he'd written himself and showing all kinds of tricks with music. So he was a real musical genius. By 1781, he moves to Vienna. He wants to be in and around the area where Haydn is active, because he's a great admirer of Haydn. And so when you're in Vienna, you can visit the house that he lived in, which is also a museum now. He wrote, well, we're going to see a list of all the things he wrote, but by the late 1880s, he's ill, and he has a series of illnesses, chest problems and so on, and finally dies a pauper. He is really not well off when he dies, because he has spent more than his income. Not that he's lived a completely outrageously a decadent life or something like that. It's just he never really was had a head for business, and so so he ends up being quite poor at the end. So he composed more than 600 works, including, and this is an example of a manuscript. I think this manuscript is held at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and so it's his Requiem manuscript. Requiem Mass. So he composed more than 600 works, over 20 operas, over 20 symphonies, so much chamber music with quartets and sonatas, etc., for small family or small group entertainment, and then some sacred music, some masses, an unfinished and very, very beautiful Requiem Mass as well as works for the violin and the piano and the flute. I mean, it just goes on and on. He was precocious. So I'm going to play a couple of examples of Mozart's music. I'm going to play something that's very, very beautiful from his Requiem Mass. Requiem Mass is a mass for the dead. In other words, it's a funeral mass. And there's a choral piece called Lacrimosa, which means weeping. And I want you to listen to this for a minute and just hear or feel how he's in this very, very fine, very balanced piece of music. He's helping us feel this emotion of weeping. It's a very, very powerful piece of music, and we'll start there, just for a minute. It feels almost sinful to stop it in mid-sweep, but I do have an eye to time. So we are going to listen to the whole of this 2 or 3 minute long piece that I think is one of the most beautiful things I know, and it is a trio from a comic opera in 1790 called Così fan tutte, and in this scene we've got two women who think that their boyfriends, their fiancés, have just gone off to war, and they are sad and they are waving goodbye to the ship that's taking off in the distance, carrying their men to the field of battle. They don't know that a trick is being played on them. The trick is being orchestrated by the third person who's singing, who is an older man who thinks that women are fickle and is trying to run a little experiment to see if these women will be fickle and unfaithful to their men while the men are off to war. So the men are only pretending to leave. So it's quite double-edged. It's both beautiful, poignant, genuine emotion, and yet we know that there's something else going on that's kind of almost a joke underneath it. But the music itself is beautiful. And this is a particular performance that was recorded at the Royal Opera House. So it's 2 minutes. It's worth listening to. The third thing I want to show you, or at least suggest that it's out there, is something that's a scene from a movie. Now, there's a movie called Amadeus. If we'd had a proper semester this semester, there would have been a play at Longstreet Theatre done by the theatre department and the students there called Amadeus. And it's an awful pity that it didn't play because of the fact that we all had to go online. But it's a play by a chap called Peter Sheffer. It's a complete fiction, but it's a fabulous representation, a suggestion of how radically new Mozart was, how different Mozart was in the world that he inhabited. Amadeus, I can only highly recommend it as a movie, and I'm just going to show you a clip from it. Amadeus, it creates a fictional murder story. Whether or not somebody who was jealous of Mozart actually contrived to kill him is the question that the play and the movie asks. But in doing so, it shows why people around him might have been very resentful of him during his lifetime. It's a play that mixes modern style with some historical detail. And it's a lot of fun. So this is a scene where Mozart is finally getting to see the emperor. Of course, the emperor would be Joseph II, and he's going to spend his time persuading the emperor that he ought to be able to write an opera in German, because you will have noticed that Così fan tutte, what you just heard, was in Italian. So Mozart and all of the great opera composers of the era are writing music for Italian words, and Mozart felt very strongly that German was also a great language for opera, and he eventually won out. We'll hear a little bit of one of his German operas in closing this lecture, but he persuaded he got permission. He needed permission from so many people to do this, especially the emperor, to write an opera in this language that was considered not operatic, German, and he wrote an opera in the end called Die Entführung aus dem Sarai. It's about this. The Entführung is when someone's taken against their will out of the seraglio. It's a weird plot, but it's a German language opera. So anyway, so this is a bit of fun, and I would recommend to you that you just watch the whole of the movie Amadeus, because it's fun and it's also kind of serious. So here's that scene. This is Mozart, kind of a camp overdressed Mozart coming to see the emperor. The emperor is playing a piece of music that was written by one of Mozart's great admirers at court. This man ends up being the person who will come to hate Mozart, because he thinks Mozart looks down on him, or he thinks God has created this genius in Mozart only to show him that he is not a talented composer. So this is the worst of his nightmares, because he thinks he's a good composer, but now the very poor piano player, the Kaiser, is going to play his piece of music for Mozart. So it's kind of funny.
G, Majesty. Excellent. Very good. Very good, Majesty. Tempo. Up. Lightly, then strongly. The march, Majesty, march. Again.
Majesty.
Gentlemen, please, a little less enthusiasm, I beg you. Mozart.
Majesty.
No, please. It's not a holy relic. You know, we have met before, in this very room. Perhaps you don't remember it. You were only 6 years old. He was giving the most delightful concert here. As he got off the stool, he slipped and fell. My own sister, Antoinette, helped him up. And you know what he did? He jumped into her arms and said, "Will you marry me, yes or no?" You know all these gentlemen.
I'm going to stop that there just to give you a suggestion of what that movie is like. But in the scene, he goes on to say that he really would like to write an opera in German. It's important to know that, of course, a lot of this is very staged, and we don't know that that's what Mozart was like. But what the movie really gets across is that he was so different. He was this breath of fresh air in the world in which he lived. So I'm going to close by talking about his final opera. Technically, it's he did start another opera after this, but he finished it before he finished this. So this is the Zauberflöte, which is the magic flute, and it's kind of a musical comedy, an opera that he wrote in and finished in 1791. So that's the year that he died. And I want to look at it for two reasons. First of all, it's in German, so it's one of the operas that he actually wrote in the German language, one of the first operas in the German language ever. And second of all, it reflects the values of the Enlightenment. And it's a really kind of crazy story. I'm not even going to go over the plot. Here's a suggestion of the plot. Let's just say there are good guys and bad guys, and the enlightened ones battle the powers of darkness and superstition. So it's kind of a really obvious metaphor for the Enlightenment. And the Queen of the Night represents the powers of darkness and superstition. And the enlightened men are they're like Masons, right? They're in this order that is a protected order that people have to go through trials to be able to enter this order of enlightened men. So the order of enlightened men steal the daughter of the Queen of the Night because they want to raise her the way her father would have wanted her to be raised, in an enlightened way. And Pamina, this daughter, she's a very good person and a wise person. In the end, she's the person who actually saves the hero. So she's the hero in many ways of this opera. So it's not just a negative representation of women that we see in The Queen of the Night. We also see this very, very positive representation of an enlightened woman who is her daughter, Pamina. But in the scene that you're going to see, the Queen of the Night wants her daughter, Pamina, to kill her enemy. She wants Pamina to kill the person who is her father's best friend, who represents Enlightenment values, and who is the leader of this group of enlightened men. So that's the scene you're going to see, the Queen of the Night coming to Pamina and saying, "Here, take this dagger, and if you don't kill him, I will never call you my daughter again." I'm also going to play it because it's one of the most dramatic and extraordinary pieces of music in the operatic repertoire. You'll have heard it before. You'll also have heard people make fun of it in cartoons and things like that. But I want you to recognize the absolute power that it takes on the part of this particular actress, Diana Damrau, to sing The Queen of the Night, the Queen of the Night's famous aria to her daughter. Here it comes. Okay, so we can see how Mozart is pushing so many limits and doing so many new things here, right? He's stretching the limits of the power of the female voice. He's also writing this in German, which is breaking so many taboos, and he's also written this to be an entertaining opera for people. So this premieres not at a fancy opera house in the court. This premieres in a cheap entertainment theater, and people went to it and people loved it and people learned the songs in a theater that was just a cheap a kind of a comedy theater. So Mozart really is breaking boundaries, as well as trying to get the message of the enlightenment, of the winning of the forces of light over the forces of darkness out in this opera. So finally, I'm going to, that was the famous aria of the Queen of the Night. I'm going to show you the close of the opera, which is the moment at which the power of the Queen of the Night is undone by the knowledge and the love of Pamina and the knowledge of the men of the enlightened Masonic group. And we will see the leader of these men, the man who Pamina did not kill, despite what her mother said, come out and sing the words, "The rays of the sun have chased away the night." And so the symbolic sun is rising. The enlightenment, we're in this moment where everything is becoming light. And all of these forces of anger and revenge and darkness are banished. So it's just another minute or two. So the Queen of the Night and her minions have entered into the temple, and she's getting ready to go and kill Sarastro herself. But in the background, love has triumphed because Pamina has saved her boyfriend and allowed him get into the room. So the power of the darkness is destroyed, and here comes Sarastro singing his famous lines about the power of light. It kind of kills me to stop it there because this is the last couple of minutes of what is some really beautiful music at the end of the opera. And I know it feels a little choppy. I've shown you a choppy bit from here and a choppy bit from there. But what I'm trying to pull together is a message of how radical Mozart was, how varied his works were, how crazily varied they were too, and how he also brought Enlightenment values into his works. I'm not going to read through my takeaway on the 18th century. This is a series of a couple of slides where I pull together everything I've said about the 18th century, because this is my last lecture where I'm really looking at the 18th century. I'll mention it a little bit when I talk about the early years of Beethoven's writing, but really we're launching into the 19th century in a serious way tomorrow. So do feel free to take a look at these and think about the points that I'm making here. You'll find that it's a repetition of some of the overarching arguments that I have made over the past couple of modules.